Are these Chinese military police gathering near Hong Kong? The U.S. stands up for persecuted Muslims in Xinjiang. And China's plan to colonize Africa. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This week's China News headlines. What you're looking at is a satellite photo of China's Shenzhen-based sports center, filled with what appears to be more than 100 armored military vehicles. That sports center is only 10 miles from the border with Hong Kong. Some people fear the Chinese military is preparing for an attack to quell the protests that have erupted in the city for the past 2 months. I, however, am just amazed those alleged armored trucks are keeping off the grass. On Thursday, reporters witnessed China's paramilitary police force, the People's Armed Police, doing drills in the stadium and shot footage of police and their vehicles outside. According to my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, the military police were massing in Shenzhen in advance of apparent large-scale exercises. Oh, I get it. That's why they're at the stadium. It really was for large-scale exercises. Clearly nothing to do with Hong Kong, even though one of the exercises involved some police wearing black t-shirts similar to those worn by protesters in Hong Kong, while another group of police practiced charging at them with riot shields. So does this mean that Chinese military police are minutes from marching into Hong Kong? Is it time to panic? Not so fast. The Chinese Communist Party is keenly aware that the optics of sending in the People's Armed Police to crush a peaceful democracy movement in Hong Kong is not a good look, especially during the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. But the party also wants Hong Kongers to worry that they could send in the military police. So it's time to stop protesting because the Communist Party wouldn't want anything bad to happen in Hong Kong that they might be forced to do. U.S. officials have suggested removing Hong Kong's special trade status if China intervenes in the protests, which once again shows who's really to blame for the Hong Kong protests: the United States. Yes, official state media pin the blame for protests on the black hand of foreign interference, namely from the United States, which really hurt President Trump's feelings. China's foreign ministry also accused Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell of inciting chaos in Hong Kong, which is ridiculous. Those two people could never work together on anything. Other Chinese media published a photo of a U.S. diplomat speaking with protesters under the headline, "Foreign Forces Intervene." Those reports have gone from irresponsible to dangerous, according to the U.S. State Department. They accused the Chinese government of leaking personal information about that U.S. diplomat in Hong Kong, including the names of her children. But the disinformation doesn't stop at blaming everything on the U.S. and endangering children. No, they're way more sophisticated than that. After one young protester lost her eye to a police beanbag, CCTV posted this photo alleging it was the same girl, that she wasn't actually injured, and that she's being paid off. Of course, that's not the same girl, but I guess CCTV has a hard time telling Chinese people apart. Of course, you can't be sure of the intentions of all of the protesters, especially after Hong Kong Free Press released this video. Why are protesters beating and arresting other protesters? It's because they were actually Hong Kong policemen. They've now admitted to disguising themselves as protesters to go undercover. Of course, this is in no way part of Beijing's disinformation campaign to incite conflict and make protesters seem violent. That's ridiculous.
I can say that during the time when our police officers were disguised, firstly, they would not provoke anything.
People have seen them yesterday provoking.
We won't ask them to stir up trouble, and we won't ask them to conduct illegal acts.
So you see, any rumors you may have heard about communist spies dressing up as protesters to start trouble are completely ridiculous. Why would they need to do that when they have the Hong Kong police to do it for them? But stories like that may be putting protesters on edge, which could be why protesters surrounded 3 different men during a protest on Tuesday and accused them of being undercover police. 2 of them had to be taken away by ambulance after being roughed up by the crowd. Even though this man claimed he was a tourist, protesters say he was acting suspiciously. Turns out, he's a reporter for the Global Times, and now a hero in the mainland. Must be why the editor-in-chief of the Global Times said Hong Kong protesters should be shot on the spot. Obviously not the protesters who are your undercover agents. the other ones. That incident happened at a recent 5-day protest inside the Hong Kong airport. The first 3 days were peaceful. The fourth day, the Hong Kong government canceled all flights, thousands of them, leading to tensions between protesters and travelers. On the fifth day, the government sent in police to break it up. Flights have since resumed, so it's time to visit Hong Kong. It's the Pearl of the Orient. And it seems like Hong Kong police are getting at least some of their strategies from major Hollywood blockbusters. This is police firing tear gas in a subway at very close range. That's horrible. Now it probably smells almost as bad as the New York subway. And China has rejected a U.S. Navy request to dock ships in Hong Kong later this month and in September. Finally, the Communist Party is doing something to protect peace in the region. Meanwhile, in a show of support for Hong Kong, Taiwan is offering Hong Kongers who come to Taiwan humanitarian aid. Which it's shocking to think of Hong Kong as a place where people now flee from to get humanitarian aid. And of course, in response to the offer, the Chinese Communist Party told Taiwan to remove its black hands from Hong Kong. But I wouldn't want you to think the only China news this week comes from Hong Kong. According to U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, the U.S. may consider sanctions on Chinese tech companies involved in the persecution of Uyghur Muslims. Regarding possible sanctions on high-tech Chinese companies involved in the oppression of Uyghurs, Brownback said they are never off the table and always a possibility. So we may be soon seeing the headline, Trump administration sanctions China for persecuting Muslims. We are living in the strangest timeline. And coming up after the break, I do a deep dive into China's plan to colonize Africa. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Africa. It has resources. China wants them. And nowhere is that more apparent than in Cameroon. Cameroon is one of the breadbaskets of Africa. It's also loaded with diamonds, gold, and oil. Plus, it's strategically located with several ocean ports the Chinese military would love to have access to. This is Cameroon's president, Paul Biya. He's been president for 36 years, which can only mean one thing. The people love him so much they keep re-electing him in free and fair elections. And he's only too happy to give the Chinese Communist Party the access to Cameroon it craves. To find out more about China's colonial plans in Cameroon and Africa at large, I sat down with Congo Felix Agbor at the Oza Freedom Forum. He's the founder and director of the Center for Human Rights and Democracy in Africa. Thank you for joining us today, Felix.
Well, thanks for having me.
For those people who aren't really familiar with Cameroon, can you tell us a bit about the political situation there?
Cameroon is situated between West and Central Africa, so it's in the middle of these two regions. It's the breadbasket of the area. We have a civilian president who has been in power for 36 years. Since the independence of Cameroon, we've had two presidents. Cameroon is Francophone and Anglophone. The Francophones are 75% of the population, and the Anglophones are 25%, English and French.
And that sort of ties back to which parts of Cameroon had been colonized by, like the French
yes,
and the German.
It goes back to the British and the French colonialism. That's why you have Francophones and Anglophones in Cameroon.
So when you say president for 36 years, I'm assuming that's not a fair, democratically elected president.
On paper, it's a democracy. It has a constitution, it has an executive, legislature, and a judiciary. But in reality, it's a dictatorship. The elections have never been free and fair. The opposition is always muscled out. The press is never free. The entire process, the Electoral Commission from O'Neill to Oleka, is created by the president in power, and he appoints each and every one who is a member of that committee. You cannot really bite the finger that fits you. Somebody cannot appoint you, and you work against his interests.
Yeah, so I imagine it's not an easy place to be a human rights lawyer.
Oh, it's really difficult, because the thing about Cameroon is that from the outside, it seems to be very peaceful. When you look at the region, Chad, Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, all of them have turbulence. All of them have teen post-dictators. Mr. Biya seems to be a Democrat. So from the outside, it's very okay. But when you get into the country, you start seeing what is happening, the violations of rights of human rights defenders, the Anglophone minorities, the people in the north. So the press they try muscled out. So when you get inside the country, that's when you can understand the dictatorship that we have in Cameroon.
So I know President Xi has been pushing for closer ties to China. How has that affected the human rights situation in the country?
Well, our relationship with China dates back. You know, they call it Palais de Congrès. Like the Congress Hall in Cameroon was built by the Chinese a long time ago. You know, more than 20 years ago. It just got burnt a couple of years ago, and they promised to fund it. You know, he's been pushing a lot to the east, China and Russia, because these are countries that don't care about human rights records. You know, the West, especially the US and the EU, they've been climbing on BR to try to open up, to respect more fundamental freedoms, especially with what is happening in Anglophone Cameroon. So he's now looking to the east, to the east. China is pumping a lot of money. China is involved, and I think China will be an impediment if we were to have a Security Council resolution on Cameroon.
Okay. So President Xi would be more interested in taking money from China rather than countries that would have human rights obligations.
Yeah, that's what he's been doing of late. It's true that he plays his cards in a way that he's still friends with the West, but he's leaning more now to China because the accountability issue is not there. So he prefers to take money from China because China will not care about the killings of the people. China will not care about burning of villages in Cameroon.
Well, I know Cameroon is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. What does China hope to get out of Cameroon?
Well, China needs the resources from Cameroon. Cameroon has diamond. Cameroon has oil. You know, Cameroon has timber. So China, gold too, yeah. So China is interested in the resources of Cameroon. There's nothing like a free lunch. You know, I know people criticize the relationship that we had with the West, colonialism and the rest. But China is another colonial power in thin disguise. You know, China is giving loans. There's a lot of corruption in the contracts. Nobody is accountable. There's no transparency. And we are indebted to them a lot. You know, I know at times they will cancel some of the debts, but they are getting enormous resources from us, and Chinese are migrating to Cameroon. They are doing some of the business that the local people are supposed to be doing. They are fishing, and there's gradually tension between the Chinese and the Cameroonians.
So Chinese leader Xi Jinping calls it win-win cooperation, but doesn't sound like this is actually a win for the people of Cameroon.
No, from my own perspective, it's not a win-win situation. It's not winning for the people of Cameroon. It might be winning for the government and for China. The average Cameroonian is not benefiting a lot. The government cannot account to some of these monies that are given, and it's like mortgaging the destiny of future generations. So it's win-win, yes, win for the Chinese government and win for the Cameroonian government, but it's a win-loss for the Cameroonian people.
And I know Cameroon is in a very strategic location in the region, and China has shown an interest in a billion-dollar port. What's behind that?
Well, as you said, Cameroon is strategically located. You know, Central Africa region, West Africa, we're bordered to Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Chad, you know, and the Central African Republic. So strategically, we are very important. And we have the outlets, we have the ports, we have one in Douala, we have one in Kribi, and I just hear they want to build one in Limbe. So the Chinese are interested in Cameroon, you know. They are very interested. A lot of powers are interested in Cameroon, but of late the Chinese have developed a lot of interest because Cameroon is also agriculturally, Cameroon is very rich. The soil is extremely, extremely rich. So if we are not careful, the next coming years, Cameroon will be a playground for power politics. Cameroon will be a playground for Chinese interests and Chinese politics.
So we talked a bit about it, that Cameroon is in a lot of debt to China. How has that affected Cameroon?
Well, for now, the government is trying to survive. You know, so they keep on piling debt upon debt.
Yeah.
They think that they'll postpone their problems because, you know, the more they have pressure from the West, the more they're trying to open up the economy. They are now looking towards China. They will pile the debts. Some of the infrastructures that they've built, they cannot stand the test of time. You know, and even you look at the workers, China brings almost everybody from China to work. So what is the local content? How does that benefit the average Cameroonians? I mean, from the laborers, they're brought from China. And even where Cameroonians work there, they don't pay them very well, you know. And the fact that most of them don't communicate in English, there was the Kumba-Manfe-Ekok road that was built by the Chinese leading to Nigeria. I mean, I was going to my village. My village is off the road. The instructions or the signs were in Chinese. So a villager would not even understand what they were saying. I did not find any of the instructions in English. So this is something that a government that works for the people, that has the interest of the people at heart, would have to take some of these things in consideration. But unfortunately, they don't really care.
So the infrastructure they're building is not actually good quality. The loans aren't sustainable. This really doesn't seem like it's benefiting.
No, it's not benefiting us, you know. And there's something that they're doing that would backfire. I remember Kofi Annan made a statement once that when you come to Africa and you buy the farms, you buy the lands and you plant, and the people cannot have food, someday they will rise up. And that is what would happen in Africa. That's what will happen in Cameroon. When the Chinese come with their monies and they buy huge parcel of land and plant crops that is exported to China, and the people in Cameroon cannot have food, they would rise up, they would protest. Just imagine that if they had bought land in the English-speaking part of the country, and now there's a crisis, how would they have access to those lands? Because the people also be like, these lands did not benefit us. They probably dealt with the government, they dealt with the chiefs, without the average person benefiting anything. And the quality of their product, it's not really good.
Well, as you mentioned, China is basically functioning as a new type of colonial power in Cameroon. Is there a sense among the people there, do they understand this? Do they know what's happening?
They are gradually coming to terms with it. You know, initially it was their hatred for the French. They preferred any other person than the French because of its colonial history. But I think that some people are gradually saying that China doesn't speak. They are slowly and gradually and surely taking over control of businesses in the country. People have started rising up. People have started criticizing it. People are complaining in the media, and it will only get worse as things get bad for the country.
So Cameroon is billions of dollars in debt to China. Recently, though, China forgave $78 million of debt. Why was that?
Well, as I said, there's nothing like a free lunch. They know what they are benefiting from the system, you know, and they are trying also to keep Mr. Biya in power at all costs. So they would help him. They will help Mr. Biya to stay in power. They provide military software also. Because of the Anglophone crisis, they provided some support for humanitarian to help those who are affected by the crisis. So whatever they are doing is to ensure that their friend stays in power, because they understand that if things were to change, if we have a free and fair election, if we have a real, genuine democratic government, those contracts would be renegotiated. Those terms that they agreed on, Cameroonians were like, no, it has to go through parliament. The people have to see it. It has to be more transparent. It has to be a win-win contracts from the perspective of the people and not the leadership.
The road signs might not have to be in Chinese.
They will not have to be in Chinese. They will have to be in English and French. If you want to put it in Chinese for their workers, I can understand, but it should be in English and French also.
Oh, yeah. So I know the U.S. and many other Western countries are beginning to take an interest in investing more in African countries. Do you think that can be a rival to Chinese investment?
Yeah, competition is always good. There was a time when we had only the Western investors. So they have good quality, but probably their terms were also not favorable to our people. So China is now in the market. China is another player. So everybody is sitting up. Because after a while, the West also looked at Asia. They looked at Latin America. They were not really focused on Africa. But because China is there, China has come to stay. China has been signing some contracts that initially it used to be exclusive reserve of the West. They've woken up from slumber, and they too are now getting back into the game. So it will be an exciting battle between China and the West to win the minds and hearts of the people with regards to their resources.
And you think that's something the West might be able to do?
Yes, they are capable of doing. The more democratic the countries, I think the more people want to deal with the West. The more dictatorial the country, they would have to deal with China and Russia, because as you know, they will not talk anything about the human rights violations. They would shut up their mouth, get their deals done, rights are being violated, nobody cares.
Well, that's interesting because, you know, the West, there's a history of colonialism, which obviously there's a lot of resentment there. And China in particular is very good at the propaganda of, oh, we were victims of colonialism, we won't be like that, when in fact that is what's happening. Do you think people will understand that situation, and that like the past can be forgotten, or not forgotten, but at least forgiven?
Well, you can look at colonialism from a multifaceted angle. Because there could be political, there could be economical, you know, there could be military colonialism. So yes, China was not a colonial power in Africa, but they are coming in also as an economic colonial power, you know. So what is the difference between what they're doing and what the West did? I think what we need in Africa, what we need in Cameroon, is a fair deal. You know, whoever comes should do deals that would be good for the people, not the leadership. And also don't support a leader that you're giving your money to violate people's rights, to kill people. You don't supply arms to use to kill the people. If they can be that transparent, which I think they would not be able because of the nature of the Chinese government, say who comes to equity must come with clean hands. The way they treat their own people, you know, they cannot treat us better than the way they treat their people. So it's clear that China would not live up to the expectation. I think the West has tried a lot to change also, you know, from its kind of colonial mentality. And in case there, we have numerous cases where they put the interests of the people first, you know. They, for example, like the Americans, they would always talk about human rights violation. They always ensure that there's transparency. And if you are found paying bribes or involving corruption, you'll be tried in the US, you'll be sentenced. So these are checks and balances that we need, you know. These are checks and balances that would help the corrupt officials in Africa and the corrupt officials coming from the West or China to ensure that at least it's not business as usual. Things must change, and we must also look the interests of the people.
You kind of touched on this. Is China providing BIA with weapons or military training?
Yeah, they're providing weapons. They're providing weapons to Cameroon a lot. The Chinese, the Israelis also, they're providing weapons to Cameroon a lot. They are providing military training. We have a good military cooperation with China. They are supporting lots of projects also. During the last presidential election, all the gadgets that was used by the Mr. Biya's ruling party was printed in China. Everything was done in China so that you can see the influence of China. So we spend lots and lots of money to print gadgets in China. That shows the kind of relationship he has with the Chinese.
How about Chinese social controls like internet surveillance, facial recognition cameras, any of that?
We gradually, from a human rights defender's perspective, we're getting a bit scared. You know, there was a time we heard WhatsApp had been tampered with. You know, the presence of the Israelis and the Chinese, we're a bit now scared what is going to happen. Because these are countries, I mean, China especially has issues with the internet. So.
To put it lightly.
Yes, and the war, for example, the struggle with democratic training in Cameroon shows that the internet is a major player. Social media would be the thing that would determine who would be the next president, that would determine the change in the country. So we're a bit worried that the influence of China, the role China plays, might affect censorship. Don't forget that between January 2017 and April 2017, we had the longest internet shutdown in the history of mankind. About 4 months where internet was shut down in the English-speaking part of the country. So these are things that we're a bit worried, and we hope that the internet will not be cut off again.
Do you have any sense of China's overall plan for Africa?
I don't know what is my sense, but what the overall plan is to take over the economy of the continent, to have as many contracts as possible so that they can control the continent. Because there's a fight between, a real or imaginary fight between China and the West. So everybody wants to control the resources of Africa. And because most of the 54 countries are dictators, a lot of them are going towards China. Don't forget the building of the African Union in Ethiopia was a gift given by China, you know. So China is there to conquer the markets. China needs the resources. China's growing population, China doesn't have a choice than to look outward. And Africa, for now, is a soft area. Africa, for now, is an area where you can manipulate the leaders. Africa is an area where, because of a lot of greed and graft and selfishness and avarice from our leaders, they can cut any deal with China to stay in power. So China would be a big player. The economy of our countries would suffer unless we stand up and start having fair deals with China.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. It was fascinating.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yeah.